decade, this coming decade, then there is a danger that Indonesia, like many other developing countries in the region, will be stuck in this rut where it cannot achieve that economic takeoff and will be dependent upon foreign capital. All of this is coming at a time when, of course, Indonesia is facing pressure from globalization processes. We all know that within 2 months we move into 2015, when the ASEAN Economic Community is going to get off the ground, and we're talking about free movement of capital, or relatively freer movement of capital and human resources. These issues impact upon Indonesian society in many, many different ways. And when you look at Indonesia from the local perspective, from the provincial perspective, rather from the national perspective, the central government's perspective, you'll see that this accounts for how and why across Indonesia, in the provinces, there is increasingly the rise of identity politics and communal identity politics and provincial politics. So Jokowi comes to power, and frankly, the challenges faced by Jokowi would have been faced by Prabowo as well. Regardless of who comes into power at this stage in Indonesian history, certain historical forces have already been set into motion that have created the Indonesian state that we see today. So, what do we have? One, we have an Indonesian state that is making this transition from a strongly centralized state to one where power has been progressively devolved to the outer provinces. This is one of the net results of the post-reformasi period and decentralization that took off during the time of Megawati and Gus Dur. And the reason why the CIA map is wrong is because it does not take into account a new province, newly minted just this year, of Kalimantan Utara, which is here. Basically, all of this points to the fact that across Indonesia, local power is becoming more important. And why is local power important? That's linked to the second major development, which is democratization in Indonesia. Democratization in Indonesia is a contentious issue. It's a contentious issue because it's raised debates not only in activist political circles, but also in academic circles as to whether popular democracy serves the long-term interests and needs of the Indonesian nation state, or whether popular democracy, when articulated at the local provincial level through the discourse of identity politics, merely contributes to further sectarianism and division along ethnic provincial lines. I'll give you an example. After the late 1980s or mid-1990s, you knew where power was in Indonesia. It's in Jakarta. Power is in Jakarta because Jakarta was the home of the architecture of power. The monuments of state power were found in Jakarta. Post-1998, with the slow process of decentralization and popular democracy seeping out to the outer provinces, the contestation of power has now become decentralized. In other words, during the New Order period, the path for upward social mobility was simple. If you were an ordinary Indonesian citizen and you wanted to make it big in the Republic of Indonesia, you aspire for power at the capital. There are ways you can do that. Either you join the dominant ruling party or you join the army apparatus, the state security apparatus, and you rise because the army, the police, and the dominant political parties provide you with the means of upward social mobility and social cultural capital. That has come to an end because power is now diffused. So if you are, say, an ambitious person from the middle classes in South Sulawesi, you don't have to make it big in Jakarta anymore. You can just aim to be the provincial governor of South Sulawesi. And this is what I mean by the architecture of power. Today, when you go across Indonesia, try visiting the local provincial governors' houses, offices, residences, and you'll see what I mean. Some of the provinces, the homes and the offices of the provincial governor is actually bigger than the palace in Jakarta. That's because wealth, especially natural wealth, is unevenly spread across the Indonesian archipelago. Kalimantan, for example, is rich with, in the past, timber, but now palm oil, coal, gas, oil. You don't have to make it in Jakarta to be someone. To be the provincial governor of East Kalimantan or South Sulawesi is good enough. In fact, you might even be stronger. And this has led to the third factor, the emergence of the new middle class in Indonesia. which is a major, major player and which will play a very important role in shaping Indonesia's destiny. The middle class in Indonesia is a real, tangible phenomenon. It's no longer something abstract. It's real for two reasons. There are two main drivers. One has been the period of relative calm and prosperity and development that began from the New Order era to the post-New Order era. And this now manifests itself with the emerging new middle class, particularly strong in the provincial areas. I mentioned earlier that Balikpapan is the third fastest growing city in Indonesia at the moment. That's really being driven by the local middle class, the Kalimantan middle class, who have made their money in areas like palm oil, gas, coal. Now note one thing. Because Indonesia, like many countries in Southeast Asia, has not made the full leap to heavy industries, the wealth and the power of the middle class is found in industrial sectors that are not high-tech. Palm oil is not a high-tech industry. You just need to buy a few tractors. Second-hand is okay. If you buy a few tractors, you can have a palm oil plantation. And with that, you have enough capital to launch your political career. And that's really what's happening in the outer provinces at the moment. At Balikpapan, there's an amazing new housing project that I saw when I was there. A massive condo complex that's about to be constructed based on Marina Bay Sands in Singapore. And I can tell you, it's all sold out. Man. It's all sold out. Yeah. They haven't even started piling. It's already sold out. And who's buying it? The Indonesian middle class. If 1% of Indonesia's population are millionaires, that's 2.5 million millionaires. That's 2/3 of the population of Singapore, millionaires. So this stereotype that non-Indonesians have of Indonesia being a poor country, this is not true. There is an emerging, powerful middle class in Indonesia. Adding to this is the inculcation of middle class values brought about through the education revolution. And there's one area of Indonesian society that I know relatively well, is the education sector, because I lecture in so many universities. When I started lecturing in Yogyakarta in 1998, there were about 6 major established universities. Today, there are more than 22. Universities, state universities, commercial, private universities, private colleges. What this means is that the town of Yogyakarta alone, every year, sends out into the market hundreds of thousands of graduates with these pieces of paper that are supposed to be your passport to the middle class. And this younger generation will demand a middle class life. They are better educated, they have ambitions, social ambitions, they have ambitions for upward social mobility. Again, I refer you to the speech made by Prof in Singapore, where he said that Indonesia has to grow at the rate of 8% for the next 2 decades just to absorb this emerging middle class. You also note that this election campaign, both sides, all parties, targeted this particular Indonesian young middle class. The Gerindra party had a very interesting ad. They have very different ads. They had one ad that was targeting the poor farmers, agricultural workers. They had one special ad targeting the urban yuppie youth in their 20s, saying that Indonesia, the time has come, Indonesia bangkit, the time has come for Indonesia to rise. The engine of that rise will be this new middle class that already exists in the economic infrastructure of the country, across the country, and also is being produced through the educational system. That's the third factor. Now, when you add all of this together, then you see how complex governing Indonesia is going to be, and what are the likely issues that Indonesia will face. For a start, the logistical demands are real. These are real. If you go on one of these backpacking adventures, like I do in Kalimantan, you go up the Mahakam River. It's 2.5 days until you get to Long-Irang, and after that you have to convert to get right up to the frontier. As you go along the river, you'll notice that the further inland you go, the electric lights give way to gasoline generators because the infrastructure is not there. Indonesia must industrialize. It needs to improve the distribution of electricity, because that's the only way you can make this transition to industrialization. You need that. And these are practical demands which, interestingly, at this election campaign, both candidates agreed had been held back as a result of local cartels that have been profiting from this state of relative economic decline, or keeping it stagnant, so that you can keep, getting rent basically from your local clients. There's a need on both sides. This is where the consensus lay at this election campaign. Both sides say we need to break these deadlocks in order to re-energize the Indonesian economy. And these are the demands that are coming from Indonesians themselves. That's why I say it's a bread and butter election. Ideals are one thing, but bottom line is what Indonesians today feel, and this is what they see exposed to them every day through the Indonesian media, is this dream of an Indonesian middle-class life that's just waiting around the corner but cannot be reached because they are genuine, real stumbling blocks. There's no point having aspiring to a middle-class life if I can't get to my university because the road will flood every time there's rain. I need to improve the roads first. Now, what this basically means is that across Indonesia, local politics will dominate. Local politics will dominate and then make demands upon the political center. Something that was not so pronounced during the New Order era because the center dictated what the provinces would do, to the point where there was even the prescription of roles. This province, you will produce this province, you will produce that, and I'll get you to some housing for each other. Now, these demands are coming from the provinces themselves, where local provincial power is important. It has been augmented through the democratization process and the proliferation of local media. So for those of us who work on Indonesia today, for instance, to get a full picture, if there is such a thing, if you want to get a full picture of Indonesian society, an understanding of the ground level realities is actually very important. And the local media is very telling. The local media tells you precisely how ordinary Indonesians outside Jakarta view Jakarta. I'll give you an example from Sulawesi. If you're in South Sulawesi, the most important paper you read is the Makassar Tribune, not Jakarta Post. If you read the Makassar Tribune, from page 1 to page 12, it's Makassar News. It's Sulawesi News. Page 13 or 14 or 15 is Jakarta. Page 16 is the rest of the world. So basically, from the local perspective, what matters is my local development. My local development first. Whether it's universities, hospitals, logistics, malls, whatever, that dominates. And this then accounts for the behavior of the new political actors that we are seeing in Indonesia today, where by virtue of not only the fragmentation of power, the dissolution of power across the provinces across Indonesia, but this is mirrored in the political parties themselves. The political parties have also fragmented in a sense, mirroring the decentralized nature of the Indonesian state, where local candidates appeal to local constituencies. So this phenomenon of, say, a local PDIP candidate from East Java going against the party line because he's beholden to his East Javanese constituency and not what the party leadership is saying in Jakarta. This creates a more complex and sometimes more confusing politics in Indonesia today. So where then is national consensus? And if Jokowi is going to deliver, if this administration, if any administration is going to deliver now, how will we measure its successes? My concern is that while I'm not entirely against the decentralization process, my concern is that while these processes have been taking place, the notion of an Indonesia that has always been the unifying idea that kept the Indonesian Republic together has not been diluted, it has not been superseded, but in a sense has been weakened or even challenged by the rise of local identity politics. That's one. Secondly, local identity politics, unfortunately, in the Indonesian case, like in many other parts of Southeast Asia, sometimes manifests itself in the form of ethnic-based, religious-based local identity politics. Some of you may be familiar with the troubles in Kalimantan at one point, where there was ethnic conflict between, say, the Dayaks and the Maduris. This is a symptom of the rise of Dayak consciousness. Today, across many parts of Indonesia, there are movements that are emerging that are calling for a greater sense of local, communal, ethnic identity. Dayak activism is now a political reality. Even among the Bajau Laut, there are movements like Bajau Bangkit, trying to unite the Bajau community so that they can lobby Jakarta. So what happens to Jakarta? Jakarta's power as a center that determines the periphery has now altered. That relationship between center and periphery has been altered somewhat by these new political realities. Jakarta now becomes the lobbying point, where the periphery goes to the center to lobby for the demands from the periphery. So everyone goes. If you're a newly emerging political leader or an economic figure from, say, North Sumatra, North Kalimantan, North Sulawesi or whatever, you go to Jakarta to lobby for your project. And to get it then, to get the capital transferred back to your respective province, for you to win credit and support from your own local constituents. The sense of a national vision, in a sense, has been compromised slightly or diluted. That's one worrying thing for me. The other worrying thing, and I'll end with this, is how this emergence of a new middle class in Indonesia can go two ways. The conventional Eurocentric theory is that the middle class is the agent of democratic change. You have a middle class, the middle class would support social reforms and social changes that lead to a more professional society, more accountability, more transparency, and eventually creating a more prosperous, developed civil society. Does that actually really happen, particularly in the context of Southeast Asia? Well, if you look at Thailand, you look at some other countries in Southeast Asia, you can see that the middle class has also sometimes been the force of reactionary change in politics. When we look at the middle class in Indonesia today, partly because of this perception that globalization is a double-edged sword that may benefit some quarters of Indonesian society and be seen as a threat to other sectors of the Indonesian society, then the middle class in Indonesia is not necessarily the best friend of globalization. And if you've been following Indonesian politics, domestic politics over the last 5 years, you will note that whenever there's been a spat between Indonesia and its neighbors, not only Malaysia, but also a few other countries, these are on issues like appropriation